Let's turn back the clock to a century ago, where in 1923, and the Bombay Legislative Council has just passed a resolution enabling Dalits to access public places like wells and water tanks. 4 years later, in 1927, however, Savarnas continued to prevent Dalits from accessing drinking water. On 20th March that year, Babasaheb Ambedkar led a public demonstration where Dalits collectively drank water from a public tank in Maharashtra's Mahad district. While these were landmark acts, Savarnas continue to prevent Dalits almost a century later, and particularly Dalit women, from accessing drinking water. We'll learn more about this and the important shifts brought under the colonial, post-colonial and liberalisation periods in India. I'm Abhishek, and this week on Research Radio, we'll speak to Deepa Joshi about access to water. Dr. Joshi is with the International Water Management Institutes and the Research Program on Water, Land and Ecosystems, where she is the Gender, Youth and Inclusion Lead. We'll be discussing her EPW article titled Caste, Gender and the Rhetoric of Reform in India's Drinking Water Sector. I've shared a link to it in the show notes. Thank you for joining us on the show, Deepa.
Thank you very much for having me, Abhishek. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes. So could you start by telling us about what made you interested in focusing on access to drinking water in India?
I think the question becomes a bit more specific for me, and it goes down to growing up as a young girl in the eastern Himalayan town of Darjeeling, and my own experiences with acute water scarcity and my own sort of intrigue with the fact that, we had so much rainfall, everything was so green and fertile, and Darjeeling was far removed from any pictures and images of water scarcity that one normally visualizes. And yet I grew up in acute water scarcity, where we would get, as a household, about 2 to 3 buckets of water a day from the municipal services, and not regularly as well. And so there was no other option but having to rely on carrying water or having water carried from groundwater springs, which are common in the area. And so enormous energy, effort, and also money went into this process. But also, I think, growing up as a young adult and really having to deal with rationing water for everyday household use, for bathing, for washing, were things that really stuck with me as a person. And as I said, for me, the issue was not just of water in India. It was really this intrigue about how come we were supposedly located in the Himalayan water towers and yet grew up experiencing such acute water scarcity. So that has always remained at the back of my mind as something that's very personal, and that's also very political, in the sense these questions about why would I then experience relative abundance when I went down, let's say, in North India, where everything pointed out to a scarcity of water, but yet, the taps were flowing.
Yes. I think that helps understand the urgency with which you've written the EPW article. Could you take our listeners to your research site, Kumaon in Uttarakhand, and describe what it's like in terms of access to water?
My first experience on the gender dimensions of water in Kumaon was as a young bride, when I went into our ancestral village near the town of Almora, which is quite famous, but the village itself is called Mala, very small. So one of the first things that I was asked to do, and even though I did not live there, this was just like an occasional, this was a first time visit to the ancestral village. I was given a small container and asked to go and fetch water from the spring. And I'm reminded that this is like a ritualistic ceremony for a young bride, that when you get married and come into these villages, you're acquainted with the water source, and you're also reminded of your responsibility for fetching water. And the elders in the village wanted me to do that, even though they knew I wasn't going to be staying there, etc. It was just like a ceremonial thing that they wanted me to undertake. And it sort of struck me that, okay, this in a way, it's also cementing, the responsibility of women to water. Not that I would necessarily experience it, but if I were to put myself in the place of any other young bride who actually lives in the village, this would be the work. And also on this very first visit to this underground water spring and the beautiful structure that was built over it, and it looked very pretty, very beautiful. And I was also reminded to take my shoes off when I walked into the structure to fetch water. And I was asked, to bow down and to sort of bow my head in prayer, and was told that this was a sacred space. And then when I started asking questions, then obviously, the women around me said, this is sacred. So we don't come here when we are mensurating because we are polluted then. So that was the first earliest memory that I had. But then, so much more I came to see in my research as to how this fetching of water being a gendered responsibility, and the exclusion of certain groups of people, primarily the Dalits in the village, come together, and how this is not just about gender, not just about caste, but it is really it's an intersectional inequality that impacts obviously the most, Dalit women, who face the both of these disparities.
Yes, and that segues nicely to one of the quotes you use that I wanted to draw our listeners' attention to, where one of your interlocutors, a Dalit woman, said, quote, "Water scarcity is to sit up the whole night filling a container glass by glass as it trickles into our small spring. We often don't wash the utensils and just wipe them with a cloth. We feel so dirty and unclean in the summer. We do not wash our clothes for weeks, just rinsing them with a little water. These people say we are dirty and smell, but how can we be clean without water?" End quote. Could you expand on this quote?
Sure. If you read a paper that I had written long ago on pollution and purity and the role of water, here I've expressed, in great detail how water has been the medium of creating and constituting and maintaining pollution, and as well as gender, but also water. If you understand the fourfold caste system in Hinduism and those who lie outside of this fourfold caste system, the Dalits, it's very clear that these are the people who have been socially allocated the most so-called polluting tasks, which are essentially related with dirt, with feces, with death, with rituals of cleansing or rituals of death and birth. So all of these tasks, which were considered polluting in Hinduism, and whereas, any Hindu family undergoes a ritualistic pollution, let's say during death or during birth or after sexual intercourse or after going to the toilet and coming in contact with feces, all of this can be washed away with water. Whereas, the pollution, that is associated with the Dalits obviously is permanently cast in stone, right? So that can never be washed away. And obviously the lines between the castes are irreversible as well. So you can't jump from one to the other. And this also sort of really lays down the fact that if you go into the scriptures and the religious texts, then the role of water in both purifying the upper caste Hindus from a ritualistic or an temporarily acquired pollution is very clear. And as well as water has a very key role in sort of maintaining this caste pollution line. For example, in the villages that I worked in, the Dalits, both men and women, were not allowed into the springs, the groundwater springs that were used by higher caste Hindus. And whenever there was a fear that they might have in the, let's say, at night or unseen, quote unquote, stolen water, then like there would be stories told about how the water level is decreasing and it must have been polluted by the touch of a Dalit and it needed a purifying ceremony. And these stories were not just mythological, they were very much alive. So for example, if I take you into the village where I went, it was the same village, and yet there were these landscapes of abundance where there was plenty of water, where there were springs, where the springs were functioning, and landscapes where there was enough water, where the springs were very small, were not functioning well. And these were often locations where the Dalits were living. And there was, of course, like in all of these old traditional villages, a lot of social segregation between where the Dalits lived and where the rest of the village lived. So this idea of pollution and water and dirt and smell is very intricately linked to caste-based discrimination. I mean, and a very simple example of that is, none of that has changed. If you look at the caste of the sanitation workers, the sewage workers in urban India, you will not find a single higher caste Hindu male working as a sanitation worker, in the sewage cleaning process. Neither will you find any higher caste women and men, cleaning the streets and dealing with your dirt. This stigma and this link of caste and dirt-based work has continued into modern India and is very much alive.
Yes, yes. And as somebody who's done extensive field work, Deepa, I'm curious about the behind the scenes process, particularly things that were not mentioned in the published paper. Could you share maybe one or two experiences that help us get a better sense of the social dynamics?
So let me literally take you on the trip that I had so many years ago. So as I entered the main village after a very long walk from the roadhead, as I said, it was very pretty, and there were springs, there was these small drains that came from the spring carrying water into the fields, and it sort of almost made me feel that maybe I've come to the wrong place. Maybe that this is not a place where I could be investigating water access, water scarcity, gender, etc. And I realized very soon that this was where the village elite lived, where the higher caste individuals and households in the village lived. And of course, there were problems of gender associated with water. So the fact that the responsibility of accessing water, using water at the household level was definitely the task of women. However, there wasn't actually a scarcity problem. And then I walked up further upstream into the village, and this is where then I encountered the first Dalit habitation. There was a higher caste household as well in this location that was at quite some distance away from the Dalit households. And there were two springs that were located here. One that was for the sole use of the higher caste household, and who often, when begged or asked, might give water to the Dalit households in favor of some, unpaid tasks that had to be done for this household. And there were these group of Dalit households of some 25 households, who relied on an extremely small, poorly functioning spring. It sort of made me question that, why is this in the same landscape? It's not just to do with the fact of this exclusion. It's also a fact of an economic exclusion, the inability to invest in further improving these water springs. It's also very much a social and political exclusion, where they cannot bring these issues of water scarcity to the attention of the higher caste villagers. So for so many exclusions woven into one, which made it necessary for the Dalit woman, as you've quoted, to be sitting up all night filling water glass by glass as it trickled into their small, poorly functioning spring.
As someone who consulted people across castes, could you shed light on how your presence as a researcher affected the local caste and gender dynamics, if at all?
So it was very interesting. So by marriage, I am Kumaoni. So I was really welcomed into the village and said to be a daughter-in-law. And the village that I did most of my work was a village that was, mostly inhabited by the Kshatriyas. So the dominant caste group of the Kshatriyas. So they also sort of really respected me as a young Brahmin woman who was, Kumaoni and had come to their village to look at water. So the early reception that I received from these higher villages was extremely warm and very welcoming and very caring. I was seen as somebody strange even then because I was talking to men and talking to women. So in a way, I was crossing boundaries and borders that are normally crossed in the local setting. So there was a certain amount of an intrigue that I was somehow not like somebody who was like them. So I was somebody definitely different to them. But nonetheless, there was a lot of a very welcoming attitude. And now what happened is that when I then started to move up and went to the Dalit households, and then I later came down, this welcoming approach had really changed. So there was a lot of antagonism. There was a lot of disappointment that I had sat and lived with the Dalits upstream, and that I had eaten with them. I had somehow demonstrated that all of this was fine and okay. And I think part of it, I felt that their way of coping with all of this, the way that the higher caste person that I knew who had been very, very pleasant to me dealt with it was by reminding me when I came back that I was not quite normal, that, what was I doing there in the village? I had a young child who was just a couple of months then, who I had left behind at home. I had talked about it earlier with them. So then the questions of intrigue were that what sort of a mother leaves their child alone and comes off to these strange villages to do research and stays, days on at end doing research. So I think it was a way for them to sort of accept the fact that if I had done all this, it was because I was not quite normal. I was not quite one of them. And the Dalit households as well, I have to add here that initially there was a lot of a distance that they adopted. So they were sort of very fearful initially as to why I was there. They were very, very fearful to offer me food. They asked me several times whether I really wanted to eat. that I really wanted to drink? Was this what I really wanted? And I had to emphasize over and over again that this is precisely what I wanted, and that I really wanted to eat. And it was only much, much later that, after several days of talking, that we actually opened up to each other, to the extent that when I was leaving the village, a group of them, when I was leaving the habitation, the Dalit habitation, a group of Dalit households, the members who I had been particularly close to, came to me and said, okay, while you're going to be leaving soon, so should we, by then we had talked a lot about social exclusion, water, etc., what's right, what's wrong, how does it feel, etc. So they said to me that, why don't we, in your presence, go to this higher caste water source in broad daylight and fetch water. And I knew they were asking this almost as a sign of, will you be the person who helps us take that initial first step, And much as I would have wanted that with everything that I, could put together, I also knew that I would, and I could do that with them. But then tomorrow I would be gone, and I would not be the person who was living the consequences of this bold, daring step of not stealing water, but going directly into the water point of this higher caste household. So I told them, explicitly in the same terms, that I'm more than happy to go and do that with you. But then remember that I'm going to be gone tomorrow. And Dalits, in this village as elsewhere, were landless, wholly dependent on many other higher caste individuals for their livelihoods. And so this would have been an enormous risk. And in the end, they smiled and they said that obviously, this was not going to be possible.
That must have been a tricky situation. And circling back to what you've written in the paper, you've discussed how we ascribe notions of femininity and masculinity to the act of carrying water. Could we delve deeper into that?
So Abhishek, when I was speaking with them and talking to them, although at that point of time I no longer needed to fetch water, and obviously I had no such responsibilities, but I was talking to them about my childhood and how it had been very similar, and how we lived in acute water scarcity and I had to fetch water, and that how somehow my brother seemed less responsible for these tasks compared to me, and that whereas this was more binding on me, it was less binding on him. And it was very interesting that on the one hand that led to many stories that they shared with me, which I will tell you about. But what they also said to me was very pointed and very, very nice, I think, because they told me that, okay, so now you live in the cities and water flows from a tap, and but tell me, who's opening the taps at home the most, the kitchen taps. I understand you even have a machine that washes clothes, and who puts the clothes in the machine and who runs the machine. So they were saying that it might appear to you that the situation has changed for you, but in reality, has it really? So it was really interesting to hear them say this, and to know that they knew that as women we had certain shared similar experiences no matter where we were. But also what was really interesting is that then they started to share stories of this transition that happens from childhood to adolescence, which is where masculinity and femininity really come into play and get cemented into their identities. So they were talking about the fact that how as young girls, you could wear a chunni, laugh along and walk along crooked paths running, and that, your mother might be angry if you didn't fetch the water that you were asked to bring, you might get smacked for it, but that was it. And how that changes when they become teenagers and where they actually become responsible. And along with this water responsibility, there are all sorts of notions of femininity that are imposed on women, on how not to talk loudly, not to laugh, not to talk with men outside the family. So all of these impositions, but similar impositions for men. And just because they are relieved of, let's say, water fetching responsibilities that young boys might be responsible for, this does not mean that life is necessarily very easy for young men. And also what I noticed in my research is that there were certain married men who were living there in the village, especially men who didn't have a job, who didn't have a secure job. So there were two types of tendency that I saw here. That one was that there was a tendency to try and help in the house and to make up for the fact that they were not earning. And this was again further looked down upon by the wider society, who would then say that, oh, he's a lesser man. And at the same time, there was another type of a tendency by men who were not doing very well to re-emphasize and reinforce their masculinity through violence and aggression. So I think put together these notions of femininity and masculinity really question, the sort of rather abstract and binary way in which we talk about women versus men in relation to water.
Right, right. And just to take a historical approach to the topic, in the paper you say that the history of water can be broken down into three broad periods: the pre-colonial stage, the stage with centralized state interventions, and more recent neoliberal interventions. Could you walk us through each of these time periods?
Somehow the remnants of these three systems all coexist, at any given point of time. It's not that what happened in the pre-colonial period has disappeared, and is not existent. So all the traditional water springs are very much from this pre-colonial, times when water was not a responsibility of the state, when water was, something that was locally managed, when water resources were locally managed. And it's also very interesting that in the construction of these groundwater springs, it was very interesting, these traditional groundwater springs, these that have been written about as being very appropriate locally. And the very famous book by Anil Agarwal and others, of Dying Wisdom, and how that whole historical, well, locally adapted system of water management has disappeared in India. That might be very true, but if you look at it from a caste perspective, as was the case in the villages that I was there, so these springs were actually constructed by Dalit artisans. And then, as when the spring was finally ready, then there would be a ritual cleansing, which would like free the landscape of the pollution acquired. And then, ironically, these very same Dalit persons would not no longer be allowed, into these spaces. And I think that is something that is very common in India, from statues to temples to whatever else you want to think about. Okay, then you had, like, starting 1950s or much later in some of the remote rural areas, there were the centralized water supply systems that were set up in different states, and the supply of drinking water became a state responsibility. What is also interesting is that actually, when you look at it on paper, this was an improvement from the pre-colonial stage, because the water supply rules and regulations, in India, had emphasized that there should be priority provision of water to scheduled caste and scheduled tribe households. And scheduled tribe probably because, of the assumption that these are more backward communities, but scheduled caste with a definite emphasis on the recognition of the fact that social exclusions are mediated through water. Now, did this actually happen in practice? It's in the villages that I was in, and not just the ones in Kumau, but elsewhere as well. What is written in paper does not often translate to practice. In fact, I remember that one of my very first visits, at that time, there wasn't a state of Uttarakhand. So, it was all Uttar Pradesh, and there was the hilly areas were called Uttaranchal. And so I started my my sort of discussions and my analyses in Lucknow. And I remember walking into the Lucknow Jal Nigam office then and noticing a big Shiva temple on the premises, which made me very uneasy, because this sort of gave a very strong message as to the fact that this this was an official space, should have been secular. There should not have been a place for a temple here. But then, if you then looked at the staff who house these water institutions, and a lot of other people have written about it and have studied about it extensively, including some of my colleagues at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, that how this masculinity in the water institutions is not in India, in Nepal, is not just one of men being present in these institutions. It's a certain type of men, and these are socially elite men, higher caste men, who house these institutions. So the centralized water institutions and interventions, which were very much the domain of higher caste men within these institutions, and their sort of engagement with higher caste men in the villages who were part of the gram panchayat, who were the village heads, etc., resulted in the fact that there was not always a robust meeting of some of these affirmative water supply interventions to lower caste households. And then my research was sort of spurred very much by the fact that at the time that I began my research, there was a push that had been, largely led by the World Bank towards decentralized water supply interventions, which resulted in the villages in actually, existing state services and systems and infrastructure being uprooted for no wise reason and being replaced by called community, co-managed systems where community would provide labor and a small percentage of the actual financial resources. And these were said to be, going to be more effective because they were demand led, that there would be a place for the communities to actually influence the demand, influence the design of the water supply and infrastructure. And then that led to many, many questions on who is this community. Is there really a community? And if you look at the class, caste, gender fracture that made up for what was the local population, then that really led to a question about who was the community, and the fact that could everybody pay for or contribute labor towards these new interventions, and what would happen, to those who could not do that, and how would they be punished. And what I saw, therefore, consistently is that in all of these three different types of water supply systems, which coexisted, as I have been saying, there were the same problems of exclusion by caste, by gender, and same problems of inappropriateness in design from a gender perspective, inappropriateness of design from a perspective of those who cannot have a voice on the table. So just to give you an example, that at the time that I was there were huge meetings that were being conducted in the community, to decide on where the infrastructure should be placed, what should, how many households are going to get individual water supply, how many would rely on communal services, shared services, and what would be the cost sort of factor in determining who gets what, etc. So it was very interesting that the Dalits obviously were not at the table, and the Dalit households would be asked to come. But can you imagine going into a big gathering and then being told to sit in a certain place, being made deliberately unequal, the fact that everybody would be served tea except for them, and they would have to fetch their own broken cups from somewhere, to be able to get tea. I remember coming back from one of these meetings with a Dalit man who had been to this, and he said, like, it is very difficult decision. On the one hand, we would like to be there. On the other hand, being there makes us fully aware of how unequal we are. And it's not that we have a voice, it's not that anybody is going to listen to us. But then you also have to understand that this is in the mountain. This was also because of the fact that, Dalit households are very scattered in these remote, rural mountain villages in Uttarakhand, and the sheer minority of their numbers, does not give them the strength that they possibly have in other places.
Right, right. And was there a way that government officials and NGO leaders actually justified these exclusionary practices? I mean, in terms of who they employed and who attended their events, like you just mentioned?
Abhishek, it was not just to do with how they justified. I think first and foremost, this whole development business, which has such strict timelines and great pressure to be completed, and the need for efficiency, this often makes for a very uncomfortable fit with challenging issues of deep-rooted equity and politics and gender power imbalances in any community, right? If you really start with an agenda to address these wider, deep-rooted, entrenched social and political problems, then you cannot speed up, the work that needs to be done. So that the efficiency, equity, tension and contradiction is very, very evident and very visible, because NGOs are not, for example, would not necessarily be praised for delaying a project because they were addressing these issues, right? They would be rewarded for having successfully completed X number of water supply projects in X village. So I think that is one key issue. But also what I found in my own research in Kumaon was that one of the NGOs that I interacted closely with, who had worked in this village that I have written about, they had only 2 Dalit staff members, both of whom were in very, very sort of lowly positions, right? As like office help boys. And when I actually met and spoke to these 2 young men, it was very, very evident that they really did not feel they were part of the same organization. The sort of the way that, of course, this is just hierarchy, but this is, it's not that any other NGO is not hierarchical, even if not by caste, and definitely, position plays a huge role in creating hierarchy in institutions and organizations. And I think we have very, very few truly inclusive and equal organizations anywhere, leave alone in India. But also what was very evident was that because the founders and members of the NGOs were all socially elite, either Brahmins or Kshatriyas, I think that the sort of this ability to understand and see these differences was also very limited. And also it really did not help that the project just, for example, had a blanket assumption of involving women. So, without really asking which women and how are we involving them. So, for example, whereas there would be a nominal representation of Dalit households in these water user communities and water user associations, Dalit women never made it either on the women quota or the Dalit quota. For the Dalit quota, it was, like, Dalit men should definitely be there. And the women quota was quickly and very well filled up by, socially elite women.
Right, right. So to address the deep-seated inequities, you close the article by calling for a drastic political overhaul. Could you tell me some of your suggestions and if there are groups already that are doing such work in the space of water access?
So see, for sanitation-related inequities, there are very strong social movements, Abhishek. In terms of water supply, I feel water supply as such, there's been very, very little social movement around caste in relation to water supply. And I'm not quite sure why this happens, but I guess, that this is also an outcome of the fact that water problems are very wicked problems, right? So they are so complex and they're manifold, and they are especially evolving along very different lines. So I think if I just tell you about the fact that in the recent past, I've been looking at hydropower development in the Eastern Himalayas and really looking at issues of water justice from a hydropower perspective. And now, so then the whole momentum takes a very different stand. So it becomes an argument of local people against the government, against a huge infrastructure development project. Whereas, issues of marginality do play, and I've written about it as well, how issues of marginality play into these movements, play into the fact that those who are marginalized by various, issues often don't make it to the table amongst these social movements themselves, But then also there's this whole issue that we can't tackle so many problems. So we are tackling hydropower issue, a hydropower problem. So we need to first tackle that, then we'll deal about caste and identity, etc. So I think that this is complicated, right? So I think for me the issue, therefore, the challenge is really for social movements dealing with social exclusion along caste and other lines, to be able to understand the magnitude of these problems, to be able to understand the gendered dimensions of caste water related problems, to be able to understand the rural urban dimensions of how caste and water and gender are to play. I think there's a huge onus and responsibility on these organizations, because unfortunately, I don't think anybody else is going to take it up. I think it calls for the formal civil society to really network with and engage with social movements. And it's very interesting, Abhishek, that I've written a paper elsewhere as well on, very recently about, the difference between formal civil society and people's movements, and how the formal civil society, including NGOs, are, because by virtue of being accountable to, the official bureaucracy, how the very functioning of an NGO, is under the permission of the government of India, how the funds they receive and how they have to account for this is very much monitored and regulated, by official and political structures and systems, gives very little leeway and space for these organizations to actually tackle issues of real sticky and complex and issues of exclusion, marginalization. For me, the turning point really is of, the need for social movements to be informing various types of interventions, both official and non-governmental, and to really be like a watchdog as well in how so-called rhetorical promises of participation, engagement, community, empowerment, etc. take place.
Yes, yes. And a related and final question I have for you is, what is the role that you think your research can play in addressing inequity?
I was with a local NGO that was supported by the State Bank of India in Orissa, and we were doing a small sort of a workshop on the everyday experiences of gender, because it was the head of the NGO, who was a nominated person from the State Bank of India, was very interested in the question that I was asking, and wanted me to do a workshop on that would help the whole team understand. And initially, I had insisted that everybody in the NGO joined. That included the couple, who were the cooks, the chefs in the NGO. Yeah. And that was met with quite some like, oh, but why? They are not part of the organization as such. Like, they don't do the content related issues. And it was very interesting that at the end of this 2-day workshop that we had with the with all the staff members, the head of the organization, who was a very devoted person, very committed, and used to work exceptionally hard and arrive in the office from around 7 and leave at 7. What he said at the very closure of the workshop is that he said that I always thought that I was setting a very good example by working so hard and by being here in the office such long hours. And I realized that after this workshop that my reality is not the reality of everybody who works in this organization. And neither are my benefits and what I receive for my work the same as everybody who works. So he said that by being here in the office premises for so long, I realized that I'm setting an extremely bad example for those, who, because of me being here, will be pushed to being here, but whose realities and whose life situations are extremely different to mine. And then he also sort of, made a point about how he really finally understood as to why the couple who were cooking should also have been part of the whole workshop process. So I think I want to say this. So we talk a lot in research world about impact and policy impact, and often the biggest sort of achievements are said to be if you can shape policy, right? But for me, I think it's the small and big and not so big intervention that can be very important key milestones for change. And I question, as a political scientist, the emphasis on policy and impacting policy, and for the fact that it's been so well written by social anthropologists like David Moss of SOAS that policies might change enormously, but that does not change ground reality. And so in the hydropower project that I led, one of the things that I really emphasized is that our focus would not be on influencing policy, but it would really be on building strength and ability and capacity of local stakeholders to be able to question and challenge, interventions that they felt were not appropriate to the local context.
That was very insightful. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Deepa. You've provided us with a solid crash course on access to drinking water in India.
Thanks very much for the opportunity, Abhishek. I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Deepa's reflection on her experience as a Brahmin woman researcher illuminated how one's social location can impact the kind of people or interlocutors one is allowed to consult and learn from. Deepa's article is full of a lot more insights, and I do recommend reading it. I've shared a link to it in the show notes. Next week, we'll speak to Samina Dalwai and Abhinav Tyagi about reservations and its impact on women from marginalized castes to access employment and educational opportunities. That'll be the last episode of this season, and if you have any feedback or suggestions for the next season, please reach out to us via any of EPW's social media handles or via email. We're social@epw.in. And if you like this episode, do share it with whoever you think may be interested and subscribe to us. Take care, and I'll see you next week.